Good evening, everyone. It is Wednesday, February the 19th, 2020. It is currently 5:49 p.m. Central Time. Well, I'm sitting here at Victory Baptist Church, where we typically would have a Wednesday evening service. However, tonight, we're not going to have an evening service due to some circumstances. And so I decided to come out to the church. I was going to set everything up, put on my wireless mic, and basically, preach or teach a message, which I still intend to do. But plans changed. On the way here, which is about a 20-minute drive from my house out here to the church, and the church is located, which is basically the middle of nowhere. As I was making that 20-minute drive, I was listening to a number of podcasts that I had downloaded. And all of these podcasts originate outside of the United States of America, not from inside the United States of America, but outside of the United States of America. And they kept talking about the ongoing situation in northern Syria, specifically the Idlib province in northern Syria. And I've been following the situation in Syria. The first time I started talking about in podcast form the situation in Syria is before anyone was calling it a civil war. I kept saying this is going to become a civil war. This is going to become a civil war. So I've been following it. I have notebooks of notes that I've taken about the situation in Syria, trying to determine, okay, we've got Russia, we've got Iran, we've got this group, trying to determine which groups, trying to look at maps of Syria, going, okay, this group controls this area, this group controls this area, trying to process in my mind what the American foreign policy should be or shouldn't be, trying to see what different, what presidents have done or, should have done, shouldn't have done. Just trying to figure it all out. So I've been following it. And there are two ways of looking at a situation like in Syria or anywhere else around the world. You can look at the situation and you can look at it from kind of a political perspective, right? If you're conservative or if you're liberal, if you're Republican or if you're Democrat, okay, what does my team say? How does my team tell me I'm supposed to think about it? And I reject having a team mentality when looking at any policy or anything. Who cares about the team? Let's worry about facts. Let's worry about truth. Let's look at it from that perspective. And of course, as a Christian, we should look at it from a biblical and Christian perspective, not from a political party's perspective, but that will turn into that'll turn me into discussing the political hijacking of Christianity. But we won't go into that right now. So you can look at it from a political thing, and you can turn on your microphone if you're a podcaster, and you can look at it from a political perspective. You can look at it, basically almost like a war game, and you can go, okay, I think this group is going to do this, and then you can try to make predictions, almost like you're watching a sporting event, and it's very easy to fall into that because when you're just listening to news reports about, okay, this group has taken over this area, and you're trying to figure out, if they've moved into this area, this group is going to launch an offensive this way, and you're trying to figure it out. It's like a puzzle you're trying to solve. It's like trying to make predictions, and you can fall into that trap because you're just hearing news reports and you're just getting, information about what this group is doing and what this group is doing. And so you can look at it from a political perspective. You can look at it from almost a war game perspective. But in both cases, what we have a tendency to, in both of those situations, what we tend to overlook is that human beings are caught in the middle of all of this. And as politicians talk, as war, as generals and militaries and, all different kinds of groups set out their military strategy, these human beings, they're real human beings that are caught in the middle who suffer and who die. And when you see a number, 20,000, 30,000, whatever, you see numbers about how many people have died, how many people have been displaced, how many refugees there are. You can just see numbers on a page or hear numbers on a podcast, but they're so impersonal. They're just numbers. But those are real people. And again, as a Christian, These are people that, as Christians, we believe are created in the image of God. They have an eternal soul that will live after their death. There are so many factors to consider it from a biblical and Christian perspective, and we sometimes don't do that. We fail to look at it from a theological and biblical perspective because as Christians we get caught up in looking at it from all these other vantage points. But as I have continued to watch this unfold, this, and in many cases, just absolute humanitarian crisis, it continues to disturb me and continues to bother me. So as I was driving here, I was like, man, what is going on? The situation in the Idlib province is just, it's turning into a disaster. As one podcast put it, a humanitarian hell. That's the word they used. Well, whenever you use the term hell as a descriptive term, and not speaking of the actual place, you have to realize that what they are saying is they're using that term in a descriptive way to try to tell you how bad it is. Now, obviously, it doesn't capture, what Christians would believe about hell, but you get the idea. They're using it to describe a horrible situation. And remember, human beings are involved. Human beings are suffering. Human beings are dying. And we overlook that so much. So before I do anything else tonight, before I put on the wireless mic, open a Bible, preach anything, teach anything, whatever I plan to do tonight here at the church, I wanted to hit the go live button. And for those who hear recordings of my podcast, please note the only way to hear me when I'm actually live on the air is the Spreaker app. If you need information about how to obtain that, email me at newsif@yahoo.com. But I hit the go live button, and I want to play 2 news reports. Now, I don't even know how many different podcasts from outside of the United States of America that I currently have downloaded that are talking about this subject. It was once I came into the church, I grabbed my iPad and I went to NPR, All Things Considered, their afternoon news program. I looked at all of their reports. It doesn't look like they reported on the situation in Idlib province, northern Syria, one time. That's what it appeared. Now, I could be possibly mistaken. I could look it up, but I went through it. And that just shows that in many cases in America, we ignore what's happening in other parts of the world until, listen to me carefully, what happens in the other parts of the world all of a sudden becomes an issue that either our government tries to get involved in or it becomes an issue that begins to impact us. We ignore it until we are willing to react. We don't want to be proactive in looking at it and thinking about it. And so there are many Americans who probably have no idea where the Idlib province is located in Syria. If I showed them a map of Syria, I doubt they could tell me where it is because Americans have a tendency to ignore the rest of the world. But as Christians, that we should care about what's happening in the rest of the world. We should be praying tonight for the people in northern Syria. We should be praying tonight for the people in the Idlib province. We should be praying for the women and children right now who have been forced outside of their homes. It's the middle of winter there. They're trying to find a place to go, and there's no place for them. So this is turning into what could become a massive humanitarian crisis. There is reports that a major offensive is going to be launched in that province very soon. That's what I'm hearing. And this could bring the death toll, this could be really bad. So I would ask you, please subscribe to some podcasts that's giving you information about what's happening in the world. The BBC, the Global News Podcast, the BBC, the News Hour Podcast, the PRI, the World Podcast, Al Jazeera. Even if and it's not even about I don't agree with their perspective. Okay, you may not agree with their perspective, but if they're giving you factual information about what's happening over there, you can ignore the commentary and just focus on the facts if you need to do that. All right. So actually, to be fair, the PRI, the World Podcast, it may originate from the United States now that I'm thinking about it. I was listening to the BBC podcast and Al Jazeera podcast But I think the audio I have from you is actually from PRI The World podcast, which I believe does originate from the United States of America, but it is focused on world news. So to be fair, I believe that one does originate in the United States. So we're going to play these. I may interrupt them and offer some commentary. There are two. The first one, let me look here, is about it's exactly 5 minutes long. The second one is 3 minutes and 58 seconds long. I will play these, and I'm doing so for you to know what is happening so that you can think about it. So, I'm here at Victory Baptist Church outside. It's wet, rainy, cold, dreary day. But I'm not forced outside of my home to try to find a way to live in those elements. I'm inside here, inside the church. It's nice and warm. I'll go home here in a little bit, nice and warm, have supper, crawl into bed. Everything will be great. But for a whole lot of people in northern Syria and around the world, whenever you focus on, sometimes people say, well, why are you focusing on the situation in Syria, not focusing? This situation I've been focused on for a long time. I'm not in any way, shape, or form ignoring the other problems in the world. I'm not doing that. Just having us focus on this. We need to be aware that whenever war happens, it's horrible. People suffer. People get caught in the middle of it. Politicians come up with ideas. The military comes up with their strategies, but human beings get caught up in the middle of it, and they suffer and they die. And we live in a fallen world, and there will be human suffering. And, we're witnessing it right now. So let's pay close attention to this so that you at least have an idea of what's going on. Here's the first report.
Freezing cold conditions and constant bombing. That's what life is like for many people in northern Syria. It is hard to get your head around the extent of the humanitarian crisis that's unfolding. The war there has now been raging for close to a decade. Syrian government forces are on the offensive. They've pushed nearly 1 million civilians out of their homes, mostly women and children, who are now looking for shelter in winter, and many of them are trying to reach the Turkish border. That border, however, is closed to them. Turkey has taken in 3 to 4 million Syrian refugees and says it will not take any more. Instead, the Turkish president looks ready to launch a major military offensive against the Syrian government. The world's Shirin Jafari has more.
Syrian government forces are getting help from Russian jets. For weeks, they've been carrying out airstrikes in civilian areas. The goal of the Syrian military seems to be to drive out the population of Idlib province. That's where I reached Muhammad Al-Kassoum. He's a 29-year-old English teacher. We've been in touch since last year.
There's a lot of people who are leaving Idlib. The people carry their stuff and go out to a more safe area.
Kassoum has been displaced himself. Until a few months ago, he lived in a village called Marat al-Noman. Then, as Syrian forces closed in, he was forced to leave. He went to Aleppo in the north. Now he's in Idlib and wants to help his friends get out. It won't be easy, he says. All he has is his motorbike. It's winter, and leaving Idlib means finding shelter somewhere else.
We have a lot of difficulties to find a house or to find a tent. Even a tent now is difficult to find it.
And that's because there are so many displaced people in that part of Syria. About 1 million people have fled towards the Syrian-Turkish border since last December, according to the UN. Displacement camps have sprung up, but now they're mostly full. This video is from a local reporter. She describes the scene with families sleeping in the open, no shelter from the winter cold. This is a major concern, says Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. He's the head of the World Health Organization, and he spoke to reporters yesterday about the humanitarian situation in Syria.
Children are particularly prone to hypothermia and respiratory tract infections, and due to lack of shelter, many of them are sleeping in the open with their families, exposed to these elements.
Already a number of babies have died from the freezing temperatures, according to news reports. And if all that wasn't bad enough, now the camps are being targeted. Mark Cutts is a United Nations official for Syria. He's speaking here with the BBC.
The front lines continue to shift every day. More and more places are coming under attack. Even some of the displacement camps where people thought they would be safe have been hit recently. So there's real panic in the area. People just don't know what to do.
I'm Juman from Idlib. I live now in Sarmada, a town on Syria's border with Turkey.
Juman is a mother of two. They were displaced from their home in southern Idlib. She didn't give me her full name because she says some of her relatives live in areas under Syrian government control. Juman considers herself lucky. She's managed to rent a house. Her children aren't sleeping out in the open. But she says, as a mother, her heart breaks when she hears about kids freezing to death.
I imagine my child instead of him or her. I imagine me instead of that mother who has lost her baby.
Juman says Syrians are trapped on the border because Turkey is not letting them in. If anyone tries to cross, she says, border guards will shoot at them. Some people are trying their luck with smugglers, but they charge $2,000 per person to sneak them into Turkey.
For me, my family is 4 persons, and it's impossible for us as a family living a war.
Juman tells me that displaced Syrians have started a campaign to call attention to their plight. They're calling it Smash the Wall, meaning open the border. There's a demonstration planned near the Turkish border for Friday. Juman will be there, and she'll be carrying a message for the international community.
If the world still be silent to what happened here, we will smash the border, smash the wall, and cross to Europe through Turkey. That's our last solution. That's our last lifeboat.
Our last lifeboat, she says. For The World, I'm Shirin Jafari.
Imagine being in a situation where your last lifeboat, your only solution, is to try to basically break through, cross a border, do whatever you have to do to try to survive. There's nowhere to go. There is a border in front of you that is closed. Behind you is a war and a country torn apart with all kinds of different outside influences playing, havoc on Syria. We could get into a whole, geopolitical discussion there. But I want you to hear the human element here, right? I mean, they're real people. Where do they go? What do you tell them? What do they do? And some people are just so cold, like, well, not my problem. Well, it may not be your problem, but as a Christian, you should have compassion and care. And yes, prayer, but we sometimes have to put action to that prayer. And obviously, hopefully, we pray that there are some groups who can do whatever they can to alleviate this humanitarian crisis that is developing right in front of our eyes, even though we may not be looking at it. It's happening during our time, and they can come there to provide some kind of help. But let's listen to the second report. Let's listen to the second.
David Miliband heads the International Rescue Committee. He's also a former British Foreign Secretary. Miliband says the IRC has 180 aid workers and staff on the ground, and they're seeing some of the worst humanitarian conditions since the war in Syria began in 2011.
It's absolutely hellish. Over the last 3 days, 130,000 people have been bombed and shelled from their homes and are now on the move, running or in cars or on trucks to try to get away from the front line, and are being crammed into an increasingly densely populated area in the northwest of the country, up against the Turkish border, with 3.5 million other fellow citizens, and then in amongst them are 20 to 30,000 estimated members of various terrorist groups who are in control of the area. So what we're seeing here is a humanitarian emergency and a political emergency, offering no route out for the innocent people who are trapped in the middle of it.
Right, so civilians cornered in this corner of Idlib. You've described it as a Gaza Strip. Can you explain what you mean? Like, what's the similarity?
Over the course of the 9 years of the war, an extra 1.5 to 2 million people have been moved from other parts of the country as part of a series of negotiated settlements. So now there's 3.5 million people in the province. Then because of the fighting, they are being squeezed into an increasingly densely populated part of the country up against the Turkish border, which is closed to everything except aid trucks going from Turkey to Syria. There's already 3.7 million Syrians living in Turkey, and the Turkish government says it can't take any more. So what you've got is humanitarian hell, really, the danger of being killed by missile strikes, by bombings, and then the danger of literally freezing to death. I wouldn't use that example if we didn't now have the United Nations confirming 6 deaths of children, including days-old babies, as a result of being outside under trees with no protection at all. This is such a flagrant abuse of everything that international decency is meant to stand for that I've called for the UN Secretary General himself to go to Idlib, to talk to the Turks there, to fly to Moscow, to talk to the Russian backers of the Syrian offensive, and then to come back to New York to urge, to demand, to drive, to shame the world into action.
Now, Turkey's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, is saying that it is only a matter of time before Turkey launches its own operation against the Syrian army's push into Idlib. What do you think? Is that likely to happen, and what would it mean for the IRC and other humanitarian organizations?
Well, you're raising a very important point, because 6 Turkish troops have been killed by the Syrian offensive. 13 Syrians were then killed in return in the tit-for-tat. Frankly, the threats from the Turks are one of the few things that is restraining to any degree at all the momentum of the Syrian Russian-backed onslaught. But obviously our fear is that if the fighting intensifies and becomes a two-way fight, there's even greater danger to the civilians.
Is this the Syrian war in its final chapter, and what do you think the end might look like?
Well, this is certainly the worst of the Syrian war so far. We've never had 130,000 people fleeing in the space of a weekend. It's also the case that these are now the last 2 parts of Syria that are not in the control of the government, the northwest and northeast. However, we had the chilling news today of 2 aid workers being killed in the south of the country. That's a part where the Syrian government is notionally in control. And that tells you that if you win a war by brute force, you will not have sustainable peace.
David Miliband is the director of the International Rescue Committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
There's a lot there to unpack. If there's not any sustainable peace, then the situation's not going to get any better. You've got people trapped. You got terrorists and among the civilian population. You got a border closed. You got a new offensive that could possibly be launched. You could turn it into, Turkey, basically a two-way fight with the people caught in the middle. You have weather conditions. This is a really, really bad situation. So be aware of it. I know a lot of people, this is what a lot of people say. I don't want to keep up with this information because it's depressing. Okay, well, you don't keep up with it. You're not depressed. People are still dying. People are still suffering. So should we not at least keep ourselves informed so that we can pray as Christians? If there are humanitarian aid groups that are trustworthy, who do what they say they're going to do, can we not try to give to them so that they can be effective in trying to render some kind of aid to those people? I mean, it sometimes it is overwhelming. I will agree that sometimes listening to these reports, I listen to a lot of news late at night, and just laying there late at night hearing about what's happening in the world, it can be overwhelming, but it's a reminder of how broken our world is. It's a reminder of how broken and messed up everything is. And of course, from a theological perspective, we know once sin entered into the world, all of creation groans. All creation screams out. And from a theological perspective, we can say when something is evil, when something is wrong. We do have a moral basis for saying things are evil and wrong. And when human beings are caught in the middle of war, yeah, that's messed up. And I just wanted to take this time to at least inform you about what's happening. I don't want to get into all the arguments, the political arguments about it, but it's a difficult situation, and I don't know if any one person sitting behind a microphone can offer up great answers. I don't know if anyone can. It's complex, it's complicated, But in all the complexity, what we cannot forget are the human beings. We cannot allow ourselves to get so caught up in the complexities of the situation and the strategy of the situation and the political nature of the situation that we get so caught up in that we overlook human beings created in the image of God suffering. That is what I don't want you to forget this evening. All right, thank you for listening to this special live episode of the Theology Central podcast, giving you kind of an insight to what is happening in the Idlib province in northern Syria. I would challenge you to subscribe to a number of podcasts to keep up with what's happening. The News Hour from BBC, the Global News Podcast from BBC. I think it's World News Roundup. I think that comes from CBS Radio. That is another good one. Al Jazeera has a number of podcasts. PRI The World, that's another one. If you know of any other global news podcasts that are covering this, you can email me that suggestion to newsif@yahoo.com, and I will pass it on. All right, thank you for listening. Have a great night. God bless.